55 years ago, on November 15, 1944, Corporal Robert Anderson disappeared after a routine patrol mission in Nazi-occupied France, leaving no trace behind. The 22-year-old soldier from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, had been serving with the 3rd Infantry Division when his unit lost contact during what should have been a standard reconnaissance operation. His disappearance plunged his young wife Margaret and their infant daughter into a nightmare of uncertainty that would span decades, while the U.S. Army struggled to provide answers that simply didn't exist. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Here we reopen archived cases with respect and evidence. The morning Anderson vanished began like any other in war-torn France. Allied forces had been pushing German troops eastward, liberating villages one by one, in a methodical advance toward the Rhine. Anderson's squad had been tasked with scouting German positions near the small village of Beaumont-sur-Orne, approximately 15 kilometers behind enemy lines. According to military records, the last radio transmission from Anderson's position came at 14:30 hours, reporting enemy contact imminent, before the radio went silent forever. What happened next became one of the most frustrating unsolved cases in the 3rd Infantry Division's wartime records. Search teams combed the area for weeks, finding only scattered equipment and shell casings that told no coherent story. German prisoners of war interrogated after the liberation provided conflicting accounts. Some claimed to have seen American soldiers taken prisoner. Others insisted no Americans had been captured in that sector. The official military investigation concluded with a devastating classification that would haunt the Anderson family for generations. Missing in action, presumed dead. Margaret Anderson, barely 20 years old and left to raise their daughter Sarah alone, refused to accept that her husband had simply vanished without a trace. She wrote countless letters to military officials, pleading for continued searches and demanding answers that the army couldn't provide. Her faith in Robert's survival sustained her through the darkest days of uncertainty, even as months turned to years without any word of his fate. The small farming community of Beaumont-sur-Orne, meanwhile, had been devastated by the war. German occupation followed by intense fighting had left the village nearly empty, with most residents fled to safer regions. Those who remained spoke in whispers of terrible battles fought in their fields, of young soldiers from both sides who had paid the ultimate price for a few kilometers of contested ground. But in the chaos of war, individual stories of heroism and sacrifice often disappeared beneath the larger narrative of victory and defeat. Back in Cedar Rapids, the Anderson family struggled to rebuild their lives around an absence that felt as heavy as a presence. Margaret worked double shifts at the local textile factory, while her mother-in-law Helen cared for little Sarah, who grew up with only a photograph and stories to know her father. The Purple Heart and Bronze Star that arrived by mail felt hollow without answers, medals that honored sacrifice while providing no closure to a family trapped in perpetual grief. As years passed, the official search for Robert Anderson gradually wound down. New conflicts demanded attention, and World War II began its transition from current events to history. The missing soldier's file was transferred to archives, his case joining thousands of others in the category of wartime mysteries that would likely never be solved. For the Anderson family, however, the questions never stopped burning. Where was Robert? Had he died fighting or had he been captured? Was there a grave somewhere in France where they could finally say goodbye? The village of Beaumont-sur-Orne slowly began to heal from the war's devastation. New families moved in, fields were replanted, and life gradually returned to something resembling normalcy. But beneath the peaceful surface, the soil held secrets that would remain buried for decades. The exact location where Corporal Anderson had made his final stand was slowly being reclaimed by nature, evidence of his heroism disappearing beneath layers of earth and time. By the 1950s, Margaret had remarried and started a new family, though she never stopped hoping for answers about Robert's fate. Sarah grew up knowing her father only through stories and the Distinguished Service Cross that arrived when she turned 16, another medal that felt more like a question than an answer. The military assured them that everything possible had been done to locate the missing soldier, but for a family still trapped in uncertainty, those assurances felt inadequate. The decades following Robert Anderson's disappearance tested the limits of hope and human endurance. Margaret Anderson, now Margaret Collins after remarrying in 1951, never fully moved beyond the shadow of her first husband's uncertain fate. She kept his medals in a wooden box on her bedroom dresser, taking them out occasionally to polish them, while wondering if the man who earned them was still alive somewhere in the world. Sarah Anderson grew up as a living reminder of her father's sacrifice, bearing his surname even after her mother's remarriage. Her stepfather, James Collins, was a kind man who understood that some wounds never fully heal. He never tried to replace Robert in Sarah's heart, instead encouraging her to honor her father's memory while building her own life. Still, family gatherings were tinged with melancholy, conversations interrupted by unspoken questions about the man who should have been there. The 1960s brought changes to how America remembered World War II. Veterans organizations began holding regular reunions, and survivors of Robert's unit would sometimes visit the Collins family in Cedar Rapids. These visits were bittersweet occasions, old soldiers sharing stories of Robert's courage and leadership, but none able to provide the answers Margaret desperately needed. Sergeant William Hayes, who had served alongside Robert, became a regular visitor, his own guilt over surviving when his friend hadn't weighing heavily on his conscience. "Robert was the bravest man I ever knew," Hayes would tell Sarah during these visits. "He volunteered for every dangerous mission, always put his men first. If anyone could have survived whatever happened that day, it would have been your father." These words provided some comfort, but they also deepened the mystery. If Robert had been so capable, so determined to survive, what force had been powerful enough to make him disappear without a trace? By the 1970s, the Anderson case had become a family obsession passed down through generations. Sarah, now married with children of her own, continued her mother's letter-writing campaign to military officials and government representatives. She joined organizations dedicated to finding missing servicemen, attending conferences where families shared similar stories of loss and uncertainty. The Vietnam War had created a new generation of MIA families, and Sarah found comfort in their shared understanding of grief without closure. Margaret's health began declining in the early 1980s, decades of worry and uncertainty taking their toll. During her final hospital stay in 1984, she made Sarah promise to never stop looking for answers about Robert's fate. "He's out there somewhere," Margaret whispered, her hand gripping the Purple Heart that rarely left her bedside. "I know he's waiting for us to find him." Those words would echo in Sarah's mind for years to come, a sacred obligation that shaped the rest of her life. The 1990s brought new hope in the form of advancing technology and changing international relationships. The end of the Cold War opened previously inaccessible archives, and DNA testing offered new possibilities for identifying remains. Sarah, now in her 50s, began corresponding with European researchers and amateur historians who specialized in World War II battlefield archaeology. She sent photographs of Robert's medals and detailed maps of where he had last been seen, hoping that someone, somewhere, might have information about her father's fate. French villages that had been battlegrounds during the war were beginning to embrace their role in preserving history. Local museums started collecting artifacts and testimonies from residents who remembered the fighting. Sarah's letters to the mayor of Beaumont-sur-Orne received polite responses, but no concrete information. The village had changed dramatically since 1944, and few residents remained who remembered those terrible days when young American soldiers had fought and died in their fields. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, metal detector enthusiasts and battlefield archaeologists were beginning to make remarkable discoveries. Crash sites of aircraft were being located, personal effects of soldiers were being recovered, and occasionally the remains of missing servicemen were being identified and returned to their families. Each such discovery gave Sarah renewed hope that her father might someday be found, that the questions that had haunted her family for decades might finally find answers. The approaching millennium brought both reflection and determination. As the world prepared to enter the year 2000, Sarah Anderson Morrison, she had kept her father's name as part of her own identity, intensified her search efforts. She had inherited not only her mother's determination, but also a growing collection of documents, photographs and correspondence related to her father's case. Her children, now adults themselves, supported her quest, while gently worrying about the toll it was taking on her emotional health. November 1999 marked 55 years since Robert Anderson's disappearance, a grim anniversary that Sarah Morrison had dreaded facing. She had organized a small memorial service at the Cedar Rapids Veterans Cemetery, inviting the few surviving members of her father's unit who were still alive. The ceremony was modest but meaningful, a way to honor a soldier whose sacrifice had never been properly recognized because his story had never been properly concluded. Now I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching us from and the exact time you're listening to this story. We're interested to know how far these documented reports reach and at what moments of day or night. 3,000 miles away, in the French countryside near Beaumont-sur-Orne, retired postal worker Henri Dubois was pursuing his weekend hobby of metal detecting. At 78 years old, Dubois had lived through the German occupation and remembered the fighting that had torn through his village as a teenager. His metal detector had helped him find various wartime artifacts over the years: shell casings, buttons, pieces of equipment that he donated to the local museum. But on this particular Sunday afternoon, his detector registered a signal unlike any he had encountered before. The signal was strong and consistent, buried approximately 3 feet beneath the surface of what had once been a wheat field. Dubois began digging carefully, his years of experience teaching him to treat such discoveries with respect. What he uncovered first was a tarnished metal disc, heavily corroded but clearly man-made. As he cleaned away decades of accumulated soil, he could make out the distinctive shape of a military dog tag, though the text was too damaged to read immediately. Continuing his excavation, Dubois found what appeared to be personal effects: a wallet so deteriorated that its contents had fused together, fragments of military insignia, and what looked like pieces of uniform fabric preserved by the metal objects surrounding them. But it was his next discovery that stopped him cold: a medal case, badly corroded but still intact, containing what was unmistakably an American military decoration of the highest order. The Medal of Honor, though tarnished and damaged, was still recognizable by its distinctive star-shaped design and the ribbon's faded blue field dotted with white stars. Dubois, whose own father had fought with the French resistance, understood immediately the significance of what he had found. American soldiers didn't abandon their medals lightly. This discovery suggested something far more serious than a simple equipment loss. Working with increasing excitement and reverence, Dubois continued his careful excavation. Additional artifacts emerged: fragments of military equipment, personal items too deteriorated to identify immediately, and most significantly, what appeared to be the remains of an American military uniform. The implications were clear. He had discovered not just lost equipment, but very likely the final resting place of an American serviceman who had been missing for over half a century. Dubois contacted the local police, who in turn reached out to the American embassy in Paris. Word of the discovery quickly reached military historians and officials responsible for accounting for missing servicemen. Within days, a team of specialists arrived in Beaumont-sur-Orne to conduct a proper archaeological excavation of the site. What they found would finally provide answers to questions that had haunted the Anderson family for 55 years. The excavation revealed the skeletal remains of a young man, along with personal effects that painted a picture of his final moments. Among the artifacts were fragments of a wallet containing what appeared to be photographs, military identification that had partially survived the decades underground, and most remarkably, a small notebook with entries written in English that had been preserved by its proximity to metal objects. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the forensic anthropologist leading the investigation, worked with painstaking precision to catalogue every discovery. The skeletal remains showed evidence of gunshot wounds, indicating that the soldier had died in combat rather than from disease or accident. The position of the remains and the artifacts suggested that he had taken cover in what must have been a shell crater or natural depression, making his final stand there before being killed by enemy fire. More intriguingly, the pattern of artifacts around the remains told a story of deliberate action rather than random combat death. The soldier's weapon had been found several feet away, suggesting he had continued fighting until the end. His Medal of Honor had been carefully placed in its case rather than worn, indicating he had time to secure his most precious possession before his final battle. This was not the scene of a soldier caught by surprise, but of one who had chosen to make a stand. The notebook, when carefully examined by conservators, contained entries that would prove crucial to identifying the remains. Though much of the text had deteriorated, enough survived to reveal personal thoughts and observations written in English by an American serviceman. One partially legible entry mentioned, Margaret and baby Sarah, names that would soon resonate with officials familiar with missing persons cases from World War II. As news of the discovery spread through official channels, it eventually reached Sarah Morrison in Cedar Rapids. The phone call from a U.S. Army representative came on a Tuesday afternoon in December 1999, exactly 55 years and 1 month after her father had vanished. The voice on the other end was professional but gentle, explaining that remains had been found in France that might be connected to her father's disappearance, and that she should prepare for the possibility that their long search might finally be coming to an end. The identification process that followed Henri Dubois' discovery represented both cutting-edge science and painstaking historical detective work. Dr. Elizabeth Warren's team at the excavation site worked in coordination with military historians at the Pentagon and forensic specialists at the Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory in Hawaii. Every artifact, every bone fragment, every scrap of evidence was carefully documented and analyzed as part of the most comprehensive investigation the Anderson case had ever received. The skeletal remains found at the site belonged to a male approximately 20 to 25 years old, consistent with Robert Anderson's age at the time of his disappearance. More significantly, the height and build estimated from the bones matched military records perfectly. Dental records, carefully preserved in Anderson's military file, would provide the definitive identification, but other evidence was already painting a compelling picture of the missing soldier's final hours. Dr. Warren's analysis of the remains revealed multiple gunshot wounds, indicating that Anderson had been engaged in intense combat before his death. The positioning of the wounds suggested he had been fighting from a defensive position, taking cover while continuing to return fire. Most remarkably, evidence suggested he had survived for some time after being initially wounded, consistent with accounts from villagers who would later come forward with testimony about the events of November 15, 1944. The Medal of Honor found with the remains posed its own mystery. According to military records, Robert Anderson had never been awarded the nation's highest military decoration. His service record showed a Purple Heart and Bronze Star, but no Medal of Honor had ever been authorized. This discrepancy launched a parallel investigation into Anderson's military service, one that would uncover a story of heroism that had been lost in the chaos of wartime record-keeping. Sarah Morrison flew to France in January 2000 to witness the investigation firsthand and to visit the site where her father had made his final stand. Standing in the field where Henri Dubois had made his discovery, she felt a complex mixture of grief and relief. After 56 years of uncertainty, she was finally able to mourn her father properly, knowing where he had died and understanding that he had fought bravely until the end. The French villagers of Beaumont-sur-Orne, many of whom had been children during the war, began sharing memories that had been buried for decades. Marie Rousseau, now 82 years old, remembered hiding in her family's cellar while fighting raged above. There was an American soldier, she told investigators through an interpreter, who kept fighting even after the others were gone. We could hear his rifle for hours, even when the German voices got closer. He saved our lives by keeping them busy. Pierre Leclerc, whose family farm bordered the field where Anderson's remains were found, recalled his father speaking about an American soldier who had single-handedly held off a German advance long enough for villagers to escape. My father always said that soldier was a hero, Leclerc explained. He died so that families could run to safety. We never knew his name, but we never forgot what he did. These testimonies began to explain the mystery of the Medal of Honor. Further investigation revealed that Anderson's commanding officer, Captain Thomas Mitchell, had indeed recommended him for the nation's highest decoration in December 1944. The recommendation, filed just weeks after Anderson's disappearance, detailed how the young corporal had volunteered to provide rearguard action during a German counterattack, allowing his squad and several French civilians to escape certain death or capture. However, Anderson's Medal of Honor recommendation had been lost in the administrative chaos that followed the Battle of the Bulge. Captain Mitchell himself had been killed in action in January 1945, taking with him much of the institutional knowledge about Anderson's heroic actions. The paperwork had languished in military bureaucracy, eventually being filed away as incomplete when Anderson's body could not be recovered for the formal presentation ceremony that military protocol required. The Medal of Honor found with Anderson's remains was the actual decoration that had been manufactured in 1944, but never presented. Military records showed that the medal had been produced and was being held at division headquarters for a ceremony that never took place due to Anderson's missing status. Somehow the medal had made its way to Anderson himself, though exactly how remained unclear. The most likely explanation was that a fellow soldier had retrieved it and brought it to Anderson shortly before his final battle, allowing him to carry the recognition he had earned into his last fight. DNA analysis confirmed what dental records had already established. The remains found in the French field belonged to Corporal Robert Anderson of the 3rd Infantry Division. The confirmation came in March 2000, providing scientific certainty to match the overwhelming circumstantial evidence. After 56 years of uncertainty, the Anderson family finally had definitive answers about their loved one's fate. The discovery also revealed the full scope of Anderson's heroism on that November day in 1944. According to reconstructed accounts, he had volunteered to remain behind while his squad evacuated wounded comrades and French civilians ahead of an advancing German force. Armed with limited ammunition and facing overwhelming odds, he had held a defensive position for several hours, allowing others to escape while knowing that his own chances of survival were minimal. If this case has already captured your attention, hit the like button. It helps the story of Robert Anderson reach more people. The French government, learning of Anderson's sacrifice for their citizens, announced plans to honor the American soldier with a memorial in Beaumont-sur-Orne. The village mayor, Claude Moreau, explained that Anderson's actions had been family stories passed down through generations, but they had never known the soldier's identity. "He died for our people," Moreau said. "It is fitting that we remember his name and honor his sacrifice properly." The full story of Corporal Robert Anderson's final battle emerged slowly, pieced together from French civilian testimonies, German military records discovered in archives, and forensic evidence from the excavation site. What emerged was a portrait of extraordinary courage under impossible circumstances, a young American soldier who had chosen duty over survival in the face of overwhelming odds. November 15, 1944, had begun as a routine reconnaissance mission for Anderson's squad. The 3rd Infantry Division was advancing steadily through northeastern France, liberating villages and pushing German forces back toward their homeland. Anderson's unit had been tasked with scouting German positions around Beaumont-sur-Orne, a small farming community that had been under occupation for 4 years. Intelligence suggested the Germans were preparing to withdraw, but military commanders needed confirmation before committing larger forces to the area. The squad had approached the village from the south, moving carefully through farmland that provided little cover. Anderson, despite being one of the younger soldiers in the unit, had been chosen as point man due to his exceptional skills in reconnaissance and his ability to remain calm under pressure. His squad leader, Sergeant Robert Hayes, later testified that Anderson had volunteered for the most dangerous assignments throughout their campaign across France. What the American soldiers didn't know was that a German SS unit had been ordered to hold Beaumont-sur-Orne at all costs as part of a larger defensive strategy. Rather than withdrawing as intelligence had suggested, the Germans had reinforced their position and were prepared for a fight. When Anderson's squad approached the village that afternoon, they walked into a carefully prepared ambush that would test their training and courage to the breaking point. The initial contact came at approximately 2:30 p.m., when German machine gun positions opened fire on the approaching Americans. Anderson's squad found themselves caught in an open field with minimal cover, facing disciplined enemy fire from concealed positions. 3 soldiers were wounded in the first minutes of the engagement, including Sergeant Hayes, who took shrapnel in his leg and was unable to continue leading the unit effectively. Anderson immediately took charge of the deteriorating situation, organizing his remaining squad members into a fighting withdrawal while attempting to evacuate the wounded. According to survivor testimonies, he displayed remarkable leadership and tactical awareness, identifying safe routes of retreat while maintaining covering fire against superior enemy forces. His actions during these critical first minutes saved the lives of several wounded soldiers who might otherwise have been left behind. As the squad attempted to withdraw toward American lines, they encountered French civilians who had been trapped in the village by the sudden outbreak of fighting. A group of families, including several children, had taken shelter in a barn but found themselves directly in the path of the advancing German forces. The civilians faced almost certain death or deportation if discovered by the SS unit, which had a reputation for brutal treatment of French resistance sympathizers. This was the moment that defined Robert Anderson's legacy. Faced with a choice between ensuring his own survival and that of his remaining squad members, or staying behind to protect innocent civilians, Anderson made the decision that would cost him his life but save theirs. He ordered his squad to continue the withdrawal with the wounded, while he remained behind to provide covering fire and delay the German advance long enough for the French families to escape. Sergeant Hayes, despite his wounds, argued against leaving Anderson behind. "I told him it was suicide," Hayes later recalled in his testimony to military investigators. "He just looked at me and said, 'These people have suffered enough under the Germans. I'm not going to let them suffer more because we walked into an ambush.' He handed me his personal effects to send home and told me to make sure his wife knew he died doing his duty." Anderson established his defensive position in a shell crater approximately 50 meters from the barn where the civilians were hiding. Armed with his M1 Garand rifle and limited ammunition, he began what would become a 4-hour holding action against increasingly aggressive German attempts to advance. His accurate rifle fire forced the enemy to approach cautiously, buying precious time for the French families to evacuate through routes that Anderson's sacrifice had kept open. French witnesses later described hearing Anderson's rifle throughout the afternoon, a steady rhythm of measured shots that spoke of discipline and determination rather than panic. Marie Rousseau, who was 12 years old at the time, remembered her mother counting the shots from their hiding place. "Maman said as long as we could hear the American's rifle, we were safe," she recalled. "When it finally went quiet, we knew he was gone, and we knew we had to run." The German unit's own records, discovered in archives decades later, revealed their frustration with Anderson's effective defensive fire. A report filed by SS Oberfuhrer Klaus Weber noted that a single American soldier had delayed their advance for several hours, inflicting casualties and preventing the capture of terrorist sympathizers who had escaped during the engagement. Weber's report recommended that similar defensive positions be neutralized immediately with concentrated fire rather than allowing prolonged engagements. Anderson's final stand lasted until approximately 6:30 p.m. when his ammunition was finally exhausted. German forces found his position only after his rifle had been silent for over an hour, testimony to the respect his accurate fire had earned from experienced combat soldiers. By that time, the French civilians he had died protecting were safely behind American lines, and his squad had successfully evacuated their wounded comrades. The Medal of Honor found with Anderson's remains told its own story of military bureaucracy and wartime chaos. The decoration had been manufactured and approved for presentation based on Captain Mitchell's recommendation and witness testimonies from Anderson's squad. However, military protocol required the recipient to be present for the ceremony, or for his remains to be recovered for posthumous presentation. With Anderson listed as missing in action, the medal had remained in administrative limbo. The identification of Robert Anderson's remains in 1999 opened a floodgate of memories that had been carefully preserved by the people of Beaumont-sur-Orne for over half a century. As news of the discovery spread through the village, elderly residents began sharing stories that their families had passed down through generations, stories of an American soldier whose sacrifice had saved their lives and shaped their understanding of heroism and duty. Claude Moreau, who had been 8 years old during the German occupation, remembered his grandmother speaking about l'Américain courageux, the brave American who had died so that French children could live. "Grand-mère always told us that we owed our lives to a soldier whose name we didn't know," Moreau explained to investigators. "She made us promise to remember him in our prayers, even though we didn't know what he looked like or where he came from. Now we know his name was Robert Anderson." The testimonies revealed the full scope of Anderson's impact on the community. 14 French civilians, including 6 children, had escaped certain death or deportation because of his sacrifice. The families he saved went on to rebuild their lives in the post-war years, their children and grandchildren growing up with stories of the American soldier who had given his life for strangers. By 1999, Anderson's sacrifice had touched 4 generations of French families who owed their existence to his courage. Dr. Jean-Paul Romain, a historian at the University of Caen who specialized in World War II resistance activities, was brought in to document the civilian testimonies and place Anderson's actions in their proper historical context. His research revealed that the German unit Anderson had faced was part of a systematic campaign to eliminate French resistance networks and deport civilians suspected of aiding Allied forces. The families Anderson saved would almost certainly have been executed or sent to concentration camps if captured. Corporal Anderson's sacrifice represents the best of Allied military values, Dr. Romain explained in his official report. He died not for territory or strategic advantage, but to protect innocent civilians who had already suffered 4 years of occupation. His actions embody the moral clarity that distinguished Allied forces from their opponents and remind us why the war against fascism was a just cause. The German military records discovered in archives provided a chilling counterpoint to the French testimonies. SS Oberfuhrer Klaus Weber's unit had been specifically tasked with eliminating resistance networks and removing civilians who might aid Allied advances. Weber's post-action report noted with frustration that terrorist sympathizers had escaped due to unusually determined resistance from a single enemy soldier who had displayed suicidal determination in defending criminal elements. These German records inadvertently confirmed the heroic nature of Anderson's final stand. Weber's unit was composed of experienced SS troops who had participated in similar operations throughout occupied Europe. Their inability to quickly overcome a single American soldier, armed with limited ammunition, spoke to Anderson's exceptional skill and determination. More importantly, their failure to capture the French civilians they had targeted represented a significant tactical defeat that saved innocent lives. Sarah Morrison read these testimonies with a mixture of pride and profound sadness. For 56 years, she had wondered whether her father had died quickly or suffered, whether he had been alone or with comrades, whether his sacrifice had meant anything beyond the abstract concepts of duty and honor. Now she learned that her father had died surrounded by the sounds of escaping civilians whose lives he had chosen to protect, knowing that his sacrifice was ensuring their freedom. "I always knew my father was a hero," Sarah said during her visit to Beaumont-sur-Orne in 2000. "But I thought he was a hero in the way all soldiers are heroes, serving his country and fighting for freedom. Learning that he chose to die protecting French families, children he had never met, makes his sacrifice even more meaningful. He didn't just die for America, he died for the idea that innocent people deserve protection." The village of Beaumont-sur-Orne began planning a memorial to honor Anderson's sacrifice and the lives he had saved. The memorial would be placed near the field where his remains were found, with inscriptions in both French and English describing his heroic actions. More importantly, the memorial would include the names of the 14 civilians whose lives he saved, ensuring that future generations would understand both the cost and the purpose of his sacrifice. Henri Dubois, the metal detector enthusiast whose discovery had finally brought Anderson home, became an unofficial guardian of the soldier's memory. Despite his age, Dubois began researching Anderson's life and military service, corresponding with Sarah Morrison and gathering information about the man whose grave he had accidentally discovered. "I feel responsible for him now," Dubois explained. "For 55 years, he lay in that field unknown and unremembered, except by a few old villagers. Now the world can know what he did." The French government announced that Anderson would be posthumously awarded the Croix de Guerre, France's highest military decoration, in recognition of his sacrifice for French civilians. The ceremony would take place during the memorial dedication, with representatives from both the American and French governments participating. It would be the first time in over 50 years that Anderson received official recognition for his heroism, though the tribute came decades too late for the family members who had died without knowing his fate. Military historians began reassessing other missing persons cases from World War II, wondering how many similar stories of heroism had been lost in the chaos of war and bureaucratic inefficiency. Anderson's case demonstrated that even the most thorough military records could fail to capture the full story of a soldier's service and sacrifice. His Medal of Honor had been approved and manufactured, but never presented. His heroic actions had been witnessed and documented, but never officially recognized. The repatriation of Robert Anderson's remains became a ceremony that bridged 6 decades of history, bringing together the family that had never stopped hoping with the French community that had never forgotten his sacrifice. The process of returning an American hero home after 56 years required coordination between multiple governments, military services, and civilian organizations, each playing a role in ensuring that Anderson finally received the honor he had earned so long ago. The Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory in Hawaii completed their analysis in April 2000, providing definitive scientific confirmation that the remains found in Beaumont-sur-Orne belonged to Corporal Robert Anderson. The laboratory's report included detailed analysis of mitochondrial DNA extracted from bone samples, compared against genetic material provided by Anderson's daughter Sarah and his surviving sister Ruth Anderson Miller, who had lived with uncertainty about her brother's fate for over half a century. Dr. Thomas Parsons, the laboratory director, personally called Sarah Morrison to deliver the news that her family's 56-year wait was finally over. "Mrs. Morrison," he said gently, "we have positively identified the remains found in France as belonging to your father, Corporal Robert Anderson. He's coming home." The phone call that Sarah had dreamed of receiving for decades brought both closure and a flood of emotions she had prepared for, but never truly anticipated. The U.S. Army began planning a military funeral with full honors, the ceremony that Anderson should have received in 1944, but which had been postponed indefinitely due to his missing status. The funeral would include elements typically reserved for Medal of Honor recipients, recognizing both his verified heroism and the Medal of Honor found with his remains, even though bureaucratic delays had prevented its official presentation during the war. Meanwhile, in France, the village of Beaumont-sur-Orne was preparing its own tribute to the American soldier who had died protecting their families. The memorial committee, led by Mayor Claude Moreau and including descendants of the families Anderson had saved, designed a monument that would honor both his sacrifice and the lives he had preserved. The inscription would read in both French and English, "To Corporal Robert Anderson, United States Army, who gave his life November 15, 1944, so that innocent people might live free." Sarah Morrison faced the complex emotions of finally having her father's body returned, while simultaneously learning details about his death that were both inspiring and heartbreaking. Reading the civilian testimonies and military reports, she understood for the first time that her father had chosen to die, that survival had been possible if he had prioritized his own life over the lives of French strangers. His heroism was not the random chance of combat death, but the deliberate choice of self-sacrifice. The French families whose lives Anderson had saved began reaching out to Sarah, sharing photographs and stories that helped her understand the full impact of her father's sacrifice. The Rousseau family sent pictures of Marie's children and grandchildren, all of whom existed because Anderson had chosen to protect a 12-year-old girl he had never met. The Leclerc family shared stories of Pierre's father, who had spent decades telling anyone who would listen about the American soldier who had saved their village. As news of Anderson's identification spread through military and veteran communities, other families with missing servicemen began reaching out to Sarah, seeking advice and support in their own searches for answers. Sarah realized that her father's story had become part of a larger narrative about the thousands of American servicemen who remained missing from World War II, their families still waiting for the closure that she was finally receiving. The U.S. Army's investigation into Anderson's Medal of Honor revealed the full extent of bureaucratic failures that had prevented his recognition during the war. Captain Thomas Mitchell's recommendation had been properly filed and approved at division level, but the chaos following the Battle of the Bulge had disrupted normal processing procedures. Mitchell's death in January 1945 had eliminated the officer most familiar with Anderson's case, and subsequent personnel changes had left the recommendation orphaned in the system. Colonel James Harrison, the Army historian assigned to Anderson's case, discovered that the Medal of Honor found with Anderson's remains was indeed the decoration that had been manufactured for his 1944 presentation. Military records showed that Sergeant Robert Hayes had somehow obtained the medal from division headquarters and brought it to Anderson shortly before his final battle, though Hayes had never mentioned this in his post-war testimonies, taking the secret to his grave in 1987. The discovery of Anderson's Medal of Honor raised questions about how many other decorations had been lost in wartime bureaucracy, how many acts of heroism had gone unrecognized due to administrative failures rather than lack of merit. The Army announced a comprehensive review of missing persons cases from World War II, using Anderson's case as a template for investigating other discrepancies between filed recommendations and awarded decorations. Sarah Morrison flew to France in June 2000 to attend the memorial dedication ceremony and to witness the blessing of her father's remains before their return to American soil. Standing in the field where Anderson had made his final stand, surrounded by French families whose existence testified to her father's courage, she felt a complex mixture of grief and pride that had been building for 56 years. Henri Dubois, the metal detector enthusiast whose discovery had made this reunion possible, presented Sarah with a small vial of French soil from the field where her father had died. "This earth holds the memory of his sacrifice," Dubois said through an interpreter. "He should take some of France home with him because France will never forget what he did for our people." The ceremony in Beaumont-sur-Orne drew representatives from the American Embassy, French government officials, surviving World War II veterans from both countries, and dozens of local families whose lives had been touched by Anderson's sacrifice. The memorial unveiled that day featured a bronze plaque with Anderson's image, created from his military photographs, and an eternal flame that would burn in his honor and in memory of all Allied soldiers who had died liberating France. Marie Rousseau, now 71 years old, spoke at the ceremony on behalf of the families Anderson had saved. "For 56 years, we have prayed for the soul of an American soldier whose name we did not know," she said. "Today we can finally thank him properly. Merci, Robert Anderson. Your sacrifice lives on in our children and grandchildren, and it will live on in their children as well." The journey of Robert Anderson's Medal of Honor from its creation in 1944 to its discovery in 1999 revealed a story within a story, demonstrating how individual acts of heroism could be lost in the vast machinery of military bureaucracy, even when properly recognized and approved. The medal found with Anderson's remains carried its own history of missed ceremonies, forgotten paperwork, and the dedication of comrades who refused to let a hero's sacrifice go unrecognized. Military records discovered during the investigation revealed that Anderson's Medal of Honor had been approved through proper channels in December 1944, just 1 month after his disappearance. Captain Thomas Mitchell had filed a detailed recommendation based on testimonies from Anderson's surviving squad members and his own observations of the corporal's exceptional leadership and courage. The recommendation had been endorsed by regimental and division commanders, processed through appropriate channels, and approved for manufacture and presentation. The medal itself had been crafted by the same artisans who produced other wartime decorations, each one individually made to reflect the unique nature of America's highest military honor. Anderson's Medal of Honor had been completed and was being held at 3rd Infantry Division headquarters for a presentation ceremony that military protocol required to take place either in the presence of the recipient or over his verified remains. With Anderson missing in action, the ceremony had been indefinitely postponed. What happened next remained partially mysterious, but military investigators pieced together the most likely sequence of events from surviving records and testimonies. In January 1945, as German forces launched their surprise offensive in the Battle of the Bulge, division headquarters came under direct threat and began evacuating personnel and equipment. During this chaotic period, Sergeant Robert Hayes, Anderson's squad leader who had been wounded during their final battle, somehow obtained Anderson's Medal of Honor from the awards office. Hayes had never spoken publicly about acquiring Anderson's medal, and his personal papers, examined after his death in 1987, contained no mention of the incident. However, his widow Mary remembered him speaking privately about unfinished business related to his service in France, and she recalled him making a mysterious trip back to Europe in 1946, ostensibly to visit military cemeteries, but possibly for reasons he never fully explained to his family. The most likely explanation, according to military historians, was that Hayes had retrieved Anderson's Medal of Honor with the intention of ensuring that his fallen comrade received proper recognition, even if official ceremonies were not possible due to his missing status. Hayes would have known Anderson's exact location from their final battle, and he may have felt a personal obligation to deliver the medal that bureaucratic delays had prevented Anderson from receiving while alive. Evidence suggested that Hayes had indeed returned to the Beaumont-sur-Orne area in 1946, possibly guided by French civilians who remembered the battle and Anderson's sacrifice. He would have had access to military transportation and support through veteran services programs designed to help former servicemen visit European battlefields and cemeteries. His trip would have been unremarkable to military authorities, one of thousands of similar journeys made by veterans seeking closure. The condition of Anderson's Medal of Honor, when found in 1999, supported the theory that it had been carefully placed rather than randomly lost. The medal case had protected the decoration from direct contact with soil, and its position relative to Anderson's remains suggested deliberate placement rather than scattering from an explosion or random battlefield loss. Someone had taken care to ensure that Anderson's highest honor would remain with him, even in death. Dr. Elizabeth Warren's forensic analysis revealed additional details about how Anderson's personal effects had been arranged. His dog tags had been placed according to military protocol, one with the body and one positioned for potential recovery by graves registration units. His Medal of Honor had been secured in its case and positioned near his chest, where military tradition dictated such decorations should rest. These arrangements spoke of military knowledge and respect for proper procedures. The revelation that Anderson had somehow received his Medal of Honor before his final battle added another layer of poignancy to his story. Whether delivered by Hayes or another comrade, the medal represented recognition of heroism that Anderson had already demonstrated, validation of his character, and courage from the military institution he served. Knowing that he carried America's highest honor into his final fight suggested that he understood both the significance of his actions and the price he was paying for his principles. Sarah Morrison learned about the medal's journey during her meetings with military historians in Washington, D.C., where she had traveled to finalize arrangements for her father's funeral and to receive briefings on the investigation's findings. The knowledge that her father had somehow received his Medal of Honor, that he had died knowing his heroism was officially recognized, provided comfort that partially balanced the pain of learning how deliberately he had chosen sacrifice over survival. The Army's decision to proceed with Anderson's delayed Medal of Honor presentation ceremony, 56 years after its original approval, required special authorization from the Secretary of Defense and coordination with the White House. The presentation would be made to Sarah Morrison on behalf of her father, finally completing the ceremony that wartime circumstances had interrupted. The medal found with Anderson's remains would be restored and presented, carrying both its original significance and the additional weight of its remarkable journey through time. Preparations for the ceremony included research into Anderson's family history and military service, ensuring that every detail would honor both his sacrifice and the family that had waited so long for answers. The ceremony would take place at Arlington National Cemetery, where Anderson would be buried with full military honors in a section reserved for Medal of Honor recipients. His headstone would include the distinctive medal symbol, marking his grave as belonging to one of America's most honored heroes. The story of Anderson's Medal of Honor resonated with other military families and veterans organizations, highlighting how bureaucratic failures could deprive heroes of recognition and families of closure. The Department of Defense announced new procedures for tracking and expediting posthumous awards, using Anderson's case as an example of how administrative delays could compound the tragedy of military loss with decades of uncertainty and unrecognized sacrifice. The ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery on September 15, 2000, marked the end of a 56-year journey and the beginning of Robert Anderson's proper place in American military history. The funeral service combined elements of a traditional military burial with the special protocols reserved for Medal of Honor recipients, finally providing the recognition that bureaucratic delays and wartime chaos had prevented in 1944. Sarah Morrison stood at the graveside surrounded by family members who had lived their entire lives in the shadow of her father's disappearance. Her children and grandchildren, who had grown up hearing stories about the grandfather they would never meet, now witnessed the ceremony that would finally lay those stories to rest. The folded American flag that would be presented to Sarah had covered the casket carrying remains that had waited 56 years to come home. The Medal of Honor presentation took place before the burial service, with Secretary of Defense William Cohen making the presentation on behalf of a grateful nation. The medal found with Anderson's remains had been carefully restored by military craftsmen, its tarnished surface polished to reflect the dignity of the decoration and the sacrifice it represented. Cohen read from the original citation written by Captain Mitchell in 1944, words that had waited decades to be spoken at their intended ceremony. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, Cohen read, his voice carrying across the assembled mourners and military officials. Corporal Robert Anderson distinguished himself by extraordinary heroism in action against enemy forces near Beaumont-sur-Orne, France, on November 15, 1944. When his squad came under intense enemy fire and faced overwhelming odds, Corporal Anderson voluntarily remained behind to protect French civilians and ensure the evacuation of his wounded comrades. The citation continued with details that had been documented by Anderson's surviving squad members in 1944, but never officially recognized. His tactical leadership under fire, his selfless decision to sacrifice his own safety for others, and his sustained defensive action that had saved both American soldiers and French civilians. The words transformed half-century-old testimonies into official recognition, finally giving voice to heroism that had been witnessed but unacknowledged. Representatives from the French government attended the ceremony, including Claude Moreau, mayor of Beaumont-sur-Orne, and Marie Rousseau, now 72 years old, and representing the civilians whose lives Anderson had saved. Their presence transformed the ceremony from a purely American military event into an international recognition of sacrifice that had crossed national boundaries and cultural differences. Anderson had died as an American soldier, but he had died protecting French families, and both nations claimed him as a hero. Henri Dubois, the metal detector enthusiast whose discovery had made the ceremony possible, presented Sarah Morrison with a second vial of French soil, this one taken from the site where Anderson's memorial now stood, in Beaumont-sur-Orne. "Your father belongs to both our countries now," Dubois said through an interpreter. "He died on French soil protecting French people, but he died as an American hero. Both nations will remember him." The military honor guard that performed Anderson's funeral ceremony included soldiers from the modern 3rd Infantry Division, connecting the unit that had lost him in 1944 with the formation that claimed him as a brother in 2000. The 21-gun salute that echoed across Arlington honored not just Anderson's sacrifice, but the thousands of other servicemen who had died in World War II, defending the principles of freedom and human dignity that his story exemplified. As the ceremony concluded and mourners began to disperse, Sarah Morrison remained at the graveside with the Medal of Honor that had finally reached its intended recipient's family. The medal represented more than military recognition. It symbolized the completion of a promise that the U.S. military makes to every service member, that their sacrifice will be remembered, their service honored, and their families supported, even when bureaucratic failures and the chaos of war intervene. The Anderson case prompted changes in how the military handles missing persons investigations and posthumous awards. The Department of Defense established new protocols for tracking award recommendations and ensuring that families receive timely notification of both the status of missing servicemen and any decorations they may have earned. Anderson's 56-year wait would serve as a cautionary tale about the importance of maintaining accurate records and supporting military families through uncertain times. Dr. Elizabeth Warren's forensic work on Anderson's case became a model for other World War II missing persons investigations. Her techniques for analyzing battlefield remains and personal artifacts were incorporated into training programs for military forensic specialists, ensuring that future discoveries would be handled with the same scientific rigor and respect for the deceased that had marked Anderson's investigation. The memorial in Beaumont-sur-Orne became a pilgrimage site for military families and World War II historians, a place where Anderson's story could be told in the landscape where it had unfolded. The eternal flame that burned beside his memorial served as a reminder that heroism often takes place in obscure locations, witnessed by few but capable of changing countless lives across generations. Sarah Morrison established a scholarship fund in her father's name, providing educational support for children of military families dealing with missing persons cases. The scholarship honored Anderson's sacrifice while supporting families facing the same uncertainty and emotional challenges that had defined Sarah's life for 56 years. Her father's story would continue to generate positive impact long after his remains had finally found their proper resting place. The case attracted attention from military historians and genealogists, working to account for other missing servicemen from World War II. Anderson's story demonstrated that even cases that seemed hopeless after decades of inactivity could be resolved through new technologies, international cooperation, and the dedication of individuals willing to preserve historical memory. His Medal of Honor had waited 56 years to reach its destination, but it had ultimately found its way home. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following the story of Robert Anderson. We'll see you in the next video. On quiet afternoons at Arlington National Cemetery, visitors sometimes pause at the headstone marked with the distinctive Medal of Honor symbol, reading the name of Corporal Robert Anderson and the dates that bookend a life cut short in service to others. The marble marker provides few details about the man buried beneath, but those who know his story understand that it represents something profound about duty, sacrifice, and the enduring power of one person's choices to echo across generations. The field in Beaumont-sur-Orne, where Anderson made his final stand, has returned to agricultural use, but the memorial that marks the spot ensures that his sacrifice will not be forgotten by future generations of French and American visitors. Local schoolchildren learn about l'Américain courageux as part of their history lessons, understanding through his story how individual acts of heroism during World War II shaped the freedom they inherit. Sarah Morrison lived to see her 92nd birthday, passing away peacefully in 2018 with the knowledge that her father's story had been fully told and properly honored. She had spent the final 18 years of her life not searching for answers about Robert Anderson's fate, but sharing his story and supporting other military families facing similar uncertainty. Her own obituary noted that she was preceded in death by her father, Medal of Honor recipient Corporal Robert Anderson, words that would have seemed impossible during the 5 decades when his fate remained unknown. The Anderson case continues to influence how military historians and forensic specialists approach missing persons investigations from World War II. New technologies and international cooperation have led to the identification and repatriation of hundreds of American servicemen, but Anderson's story remains unique for the Medal of Honor that waited 56 years to reach its intended family and the French civilians whose descendants still honor his sacrifice. Henri Dubois continued his metal detecting hobby until his death in 2015, but he never made another discovery that matched the significance of finding Anderson's remains. His modest apartment in Beaumont-sur-Orne became an informal museum of World War II artifacts, with Anderson's story holding the place of honor among the many items Dubois had recovered from the battlefields of northeastern France. The eternal flame at Anderson's memorial in Beaumont-sur-Orne burns continuously, maintained by the village and visited by military personnel, historians, and family members of other missing servicemen who find inspiration in his story. The inscription remains legible in both French and English, ensuring that visitors from both nations can understand the sacrifice it commemorates and the lives it saved. In the end, Robert Anderson's story transcends the specific details of his disappearance and discovery to become something larger, a reminder that heroism often involves choosing the difficult path, that sacrifice can echo across generations, and that some debts of honor can be repaid even when decades have passed. His Medal of Honor finally reached its destination, but the values it represents, courage, selflessness, and devotion to protecting innocent life, continue to inspire those who learn his story. The field where he died protecting French families continues to yield its harvests, the soil enriched not just by time and seasons, but by the sacrifice of a young American soldier who chose to ensure that others might live to see peace return to their homeland.